last video, we got to take a rare look at the workings inside of a steam sawmill. Because of the steam-powered sawmills, there is a tremendous increase in productivity. In this listing of sawmills in the film area, we'll focus on the Port Huron area. And this lists the name of the company, what kind of power it had, and the board feet that it produced per year. And you can see that those in Port Huron that had steam-powered sawmills certainly produced more than the other ones. Introduction of steam power in the 1800s to sawmills created many new possibilities for mills. Availability of railroad transportation for logs and lumber encouraged building of rail mills away from the waterways. Steam-powered sawmills could be far more mechanized. Scrap lumber from the mill provided a ready fuel source for firing the boiler along with sawdust. Efficiency was increased. In addition, the use of steam-powered traction engines also allowed the entire sawmill to be mobile, as we'll see in these next few pictures. And these mobile units could be purchased in Port Huron at the Port Huron Engine and Thresher Company. Steam-powered engines brought about a whole new revolution in lumbering. Now the sawmills could actually be right where the logging camps were. And as the roads got better and as the railroads came in, they didn't have to send the logs down the river anymore. This photo here, you can see the steam-powered engine. And then if you follow the belts, you can see the circular saw where they did the cutting. The saw was always at the end of the belt. This photo here is a very clear picture of a steam-powered portable mill. I imagine these portable sawmills gave the small lumber companies a little better chance economically to compete. They certainly didn't have the productivity as we saw in our last video of the sawmill on the river. These old pictures fascinate me. You're wondering what these fellows are thinking. Probably, who is this fellow with a box taking something called a photograph? Imagine it was something fairly new back then for them. These steam engines could also double as a workhorse, pulling the logs, as you can see here. Note the wheels on this thing, very unusual on the trailer. In this next short video clip, you will see an actual steam mill in action. Here you have more than one steam boiler involved. Could be for the trimmer and the edger, where the other ones were just cutting the lumber. As the logging operation for the Port Huron mills had to go further inland because they were exhausting the trees around the river became less desirable. Railroads were starting to expand their coverage, and as they got closer to some of these logging camps, transporting the logs by rail became more viable. It certainly looks like this fellow has a rifle guarding these logs, but probably just a tool. But the logs still had to get to the train some way, and most of the Port Huron lumber companies were probably bringing theirs in on the newer roads that were made. But these roads weren't at all what you would expect. Not like this one pictured here. When these roads got wet, you just couldn't move on them. The roads they had were made out of wood. They would put logs down, and they would make what they called skid roads. So you'd have logs every so far apart, some were closer than others, and eventually the logs would settle into the ground. It wouldn't be quite so bumpy, but it would have been a jarring ride if you were sitting on a wagon. Horses were able to pull these logs over the skid roads quite easily. And the more logs that you pulled, the more horses that you needed. And if you look closely at this picture, you can see the logs there for the road, so it's definitely a skid road. And if they were available, oxen was a good choice to pull those logs. They were very sure-footed on those skid roads, and they could really pull. Probably a better choice than horses. We also used skid sleds, very similar to the sleds we saw in the wintertime. And these sleds were being pulled over the skid roads. They brought certain cuts of lumber into the city that way. A lumberman by the name of George Fletcher built a skid road to connect his Kimball pinery to the St. Clair River. This path later became Port Huron's southern city limits and was named Ravenswood. This is Ravenswood looking west, and if you had a time machine and went back, that was originally a skid road. Many of the cities originally had skid roads for their main roads. Eventually they were replaced with bricks, but the parts of town that weren't quite so desirable, they left skid roads. They didn't really bother paving those. When asked where the hotels, the dilapidated hotels and the brothels were, they would refer to over there on Skid Road, where eventually the name Skid Row came from, that we associate with the very same place today. I told you about the George Fletcher sawmill at the foot of Ravenswood on St. Clair River. There was another sawmill on St. Clair River a little further south, and that was the N&B Mills lumberyard pictured here, and that was in Vicksburg, which is now called Marysville. You can see in this picture here, it's not a very big gully at all, but when the horses are pulling logs like this, they might get down all right, but they had an awful hard time getting back up the other side, and so they built these bridges. So it would be easier for the horses to pull the logs. I don't know about you, but these sure look like Lincoln logs to me. Later on, when trucks came into vogue in the lumber industry, you saw scenes like this. You couldn't pay me to be that driver. The timber boom in the latter half of the 19th century brought millions of dollars into the state, both to the lumbermen and those who supplied them, and Port Huron certainly got its share. Thousands of men and some women found employment in some aspect of the business. So what happened to the lumber industry? Well, several factors actually. The first one being this: the fire of 1871. For those of you that know your history, or if you were to talk about the Great Fire of 1871, October the 8th, well, of course, that would be the Chicago Fire. We all know about that one. It's been well documented. Unfortunately, there are other fires that are not as well documented. One being the Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin, and of course the Great Michigan Fires. These that you see in red, these were basically the starting points. This isn't where the fire ended up. The one you see in the thumb area went almost all the way down to Port Huron. These all happened the same night as the Chicago Fire. The city of Peshtigo was completely destroyed. The loss of life in Peshtigo was 5 times at least as much as what it was in Chicago. 1,500 to 2,500 people perished. People jumped in the river to save themselves, and they were found boiled alive. On October 10th, details of disastrous Michigan fires began to arrive. Holland, it seems, had been reduced to ashes, Manistee nearly consumed, Glen Haven completely destroyed, and fires had swept across the state to Lake Huron. The Saginaw Valley and territory northwest was reported fire swept, and fires were said to be raging in Genesee County in the Thumb. On the 12th, word was received that Huron City, Sand Beach, White Rock, and Floresville had been completely destroyed, that a number of persons had been burned to death, and that 2/3 of the population of Huron and Sanilac counties were homeless. On the 14th, fires were reported to be increasing in Isabella, Gratiot, and Tuscola counties, and getting worse along Lake Huron. 60 people were said to have been rescued from the lake where they had fled to escape the flames. On the 18th, a large section of the state was reported to have been utterly desolated, and the U.S. revenue cutter Fessenden cruised along the shore to aid and transport victims of the fires to safety. The firestorm forced people of Forestville onto the beach or into the water. Some took refuge in boats, covering themselves with wet blankets. In Huron County, families tried to outrace the fire. One family climbed into a wagon, covered themselves with wet blankets, and headed for a mill. When they got to the mill, they went into the funnel chute going to the paddle wheel running the mill, covered themselves with wet blankets until the fire passed over them. In just a half hour, Forestville was in ruins. At White Rock, people plunged into the lake, but the lake was so rough that women and children were thrown back on the beach. They risked death by drowning in order to be saved from death by fire. Some dug holes in the ground or a bank and managed to survive by crawling into the shelter. Losses included crops, houses, businesses, livestock, grain, hay, bridges, and crossings in swamps. The lumber companies of St. Clair County and Port Huron took a devastating blow. Over 1 million acres of timber were destroyed. The thumb of Michigan was ablaze. Just a couple of years after this great fire, the United States suffered their first Great Depression. It was also called a Long Depression. It lasted from 73 to almost 1880. Major banks in the United States failed. Foreclosures was at an all-time high. Loans couldn't be paid. Loans couldn't be given out. And people like the lumber barons around the Port Huron area, of course, they were wealthy and they invested their money in. And when the stock market crashed, many of these barons were left with nothing. Railroads probably suffered the most because of the overbuilding of the railroads during their boom years and the shaky financing that allowed them to do that. And that's one of the reasons that the banks went belly up. The railroads went from building thousands of miles of tracks per year to almost nothing after 1873. Here's a political cartoon of how the overbuilding of the railroads hurt the common people. Thousands of businesses went bankrupt, including some in Port Huron. But here's an advertisement reflecting the drastic drop in prices. This isn't costume jewelry. This is the real thing. By 1883, we had pretty well recovered from that crisis, and we had also recovered pretty well from the fire of 1871. The towns were rebuilt and things were going well. The logging was taking place up there, although they're going to different areas now. Then the unimaginable happened. In September of 1883, another major fire disaster in the Thumb area. Many years of ruthless lumbering left a countryside of stumps, tops, and slashings scattered over broad miles of the Thumb of Michigan. And the fire of 1871 piled up additional layers of windfalls and other debris. Then a drought in July and August of 1881 created what turned out to be the largest and most volatile timber box in the history of Michigan. There were spotty fires in many parts of the Thumb during August, but never enough to concern anyone except a few settlers and farmers who lost a barn or a cabin. That all changed in early September as hot, dry winds continued to blow and came to a whirling climax during the early morning hours of Monday, September 5th. Suddenly, the entire Thumb seemed to erupt into one gigantic catastrophe that proved to be one of the most disastrous and widespread fires that the Midwest had ever seen. The towns that were destroyed in the fires of 1871 were once again destroyed in the fires of 1881. During the 10 years after the 1871 fire, more settlers and farmers went into the Thumb area, so the loss of life was greater. And as this newspaper article says, there was many scenes of horror. The people of the 4 counties in the Thumb area suffered as men and women had rarely suffered. Some of the folks trying to escape were lifted from the ground by the strong wind and were seized by the flames as they fell. Some saved their lives by scooping holes in the earth and burying their faces to escape suffocation, the fire meanwhile burning up their clothes and blistering their flesh. Many jumped into wells to escape the fire, and many were found dead in those wells the next day or the following day. Some people were saved by rushing into fields of green corn and burying their bodies in the soil. One man crawled into the carcass of an elk he had just shot and gutted. Towns that were destroyed in the fires of 1871 were once again destroyed in the fires of 1881. The largest number of people, 400 of them, saved themselves by taking refuge in the new brick county courthouse in Bad Axe. Men took turns pumping water and drenching the building through the day and night as the temperature inside the building soared to 110 degrees. While the building and its occupants escaped destruction, more houses and other buildings burned in Bad Axe than in any other town. Forester, Michigan, which lost so many buildings in the fire of 1871, lost 143 buildings in this fire. And as the fire worked its way further south, it diminished. And by the time it got to Lexington, there was only 14 buildings lost in Lexington. As far as I know, there were no buildings lost in Port Huron. After the fire of 1881, more than 14,000 people were made dependent upon public aid. 1,480 barns, 1,521 dwellings, and 51 schools were destroyed. The fire was directly responsible for at least 300 deaths. The response of the American people from all parts of the country was most generous. The greatest help coming, of course, from the folks in Michigan. Chicago is also said to donate liberally, perhaps in remembrance of that city's own fire tragedy 10 years earlier. In the same year, 1881, Clara Barton, at the age of 60, founded the American Red Cross. The organization's first official disaster relief operation was its response to the Michigan Thumb Fire of 1881. The Red Cross provided money, clothes, and household items. With the help of Omar Conker, Port Huron became the relief distribution center for the disaster area. The Opera House in Port Huron was designated the disaster relief headquarters for distribution of the supplies coming into the city. So as the supplies came into Port Huron through either ship or rail, and in some cases just by the road, they were taken to the Opera Center, and then they would distribute them to the ones that they felt was most in need of the supplies. And you can see that's what they're doing in this photograph here. The consequences for Port Huron from the destruction wrought in 1871, combined with the effects of the financial panic of 1873, and then, of course, there was the subsequent depression and also marine and shipbuilding interests. It marked the years between 1873 and 1879 as a time of no actual growth for the city of Port Huron. And then in the dawn of the city's recovery from the financial strain of the 1870s, the fire of 1881 was ill-timed at best, as the consequences of lost resources and revenue had a wide spread effect on a city that so benefited from the timber of the North. I hope in these last 4 videos you've come to appreciate the wonderful chapter in Port Huron's history of the logging and lumber industry, because there was a time when the lumber and logging industry was king in Port Huron. In our next video, we'll look at the history of the Port Huron-Sarnia ferry system.